I apologize. Um, oh, excuse me. Wait. Okay. Um, okay. So this lead off is going to be about the the whole issue of Venezuela and the repression against the workers, right? So to begin with, of course, Hugo Chavez's Bolivarian Revolution, inspired millions of people all over the world between, especially during the period of 2003 to 2013, which were the 10 golden years of the revolution, as they're called. Um, in a country that had massive poverty, um, the Bolivarian Revolution under Chavez's government, implemented uh, a lot of programs that cut poverty um, in healthcare, education, um, nutrition, food support, like nutrition support, and also there were experiments done with things like workers' cooperatives, right, and agricultural cooperatives, etc. And um, Hugo Chavez implemented a system of price controls and also partly but not entirely expropriated some of the capital of the capitalists. Most of the Bolivarian Revolution was financed with oil revenue, right? That was how he did it, and his theory was because he said that he didn't want to repeat the same mistakes as the Soviet Union, so he didn't. He said we're not going to nationalize everything. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use the revenue from oil to finance the construction of socialism, and we don't need to really expropriate everything from the capitalists. We can allow the progressive capitalists to do their thing as long as they don't work against the revolution, which is kind of like an illusion that he had, because ultimately Chavez, even though he was a good man, he was a left centrist, right? Um, Anyways, the capitalists, of course, they didn't just accept this or go along with this. I mean, they implemented um, all sorts of sabotage against the Chavez government. The worst they did, of course, was when they had the coup in April of 2002, when Pedro Carmona took over for a day with backing from the American government, and what brought down that coup government was the people's counter coup, because the Chavez supporters, millions of Chavez supporters, came to the streets demanding that Chavez be put back in power, and then the army joined the people, and the coup lost control of the situation, and Chavez was put back in power. Then there was an oil strike, right, when the management of PDVSA, which was basically like a corporate, at that point, PDVSA was administered like a capitalist corporation. The management, which was neoliberal, they started a strike, right, and they paralyzed all production in 2003. That's another thing they did. But in general, I mean, they did all sorts of stuff. They sabotaged production. They engaged in smuggling. They created artificial shortages of goods. They took capital out of the country, and they even had investment strikes where they would deny investment into the economy. And all this was done, of course, with help from American imperialism. Yeah, and then between 2003 and 2013, the 10 golden years, is when you have when Chavez launches the social programs, right? Which is it's called the Bolivarian Misiones, the Bolivarian missions. And I mean, these were run by various government bodies and ministries. The Misiones provided adult literacy programs. They offered free community health care to impoverished communities, and these healthcare services were staffed by Cuban doctors. They constructed low-income housing for the poor and subsidized food and other consumer goods. And all this was paid for, of course, with oil revenue, mostly, partly. I mean, there was some expropriation, but it was mostly paid for by oil revenue. An example, the Misión Milagro program had the Venezuela and Cuban governments collaborate to perform free eye care surgeries to over 1,139,798 people from all over Latin America, with an average of 5,000 operations occurring on a weekly basis in 74 medical centers around Venezuela and Cuba as of July 2010, right? So that's one example of the misiones, just one. There were many other misiones, but that's just one example. And you see how many people benefit, like over 1 million people. The poverty rate was cut during the years of the Bolivarian Revolution. The household poverty rate was reduced by 12.9% between 1999 and 2005. There was a 14.4% reduction in extreme poverty during the same period. The Venezuelan economy grew by 17.9% in 2004 and by 9.3% in 2005. And this was the period when Chavez began experiments with workers' control in the light industries and services, and with the establishment of a network of agricultural cooperatives modeled on the Sandinista experience in Nicaragua in the 1980s. And during that time period, of course, the Sandinistas came back to power in 2006. The first thing the Sandinistas did was to send a delegation to Venezuela to help Chavez set up these cooperatives, right? The Sandinista advisors were the ones who got Chavez to set everything up with the, what was it called? The Zamora Peasants Front was the organization of the peasants involved in this cooperative thing. The income poverty rate in Venezuela dropped by more than half, from 54% of households below poverty level in the first half of 2003 down to 26% at the end of 2008. So a drop from 54% to 26% between 2003 and 2008. And extreme poverty, which is extreme poverty is like people who are like digging for food in the trash can, all right, in trash cans and stuff. That fell by 72% between 2003 and 2008. And programs made extreme poverty fall by 72%, right? And of course, all those gains have been reversed since 2014, unfortunately. I mean, it's tragic. After Chavez died in March of 2013, and the global oil prices fell in 2014, that spelled a total economic catastrophe for Venezuela, right? Basically, the state income, the state revenue collapsed. I mean, and I've seen the chart. If you see the chart, it's sad. It's like it goes from like it fell by more than half. It was like a 2/3 collapse, contraction in a matter of like a few months of the state revenue. And I mean, it was horrible. So the economic policy response of the Maduro regime was to engage in quantitative easing, you know, a quantitative easing to like offset the fall in state revenue. And you know, and you know, I mean, basically what he did is he told the central bank to issue millions of bolívares fuertes, which was the currency, electronically, right? And bolívares fuerte, fiat money. So basically, all this fiat money is running around the economy, and there is no production to back it up. There is no whatever, and it led to a massive hyperinflation. You know, a massive hyperinflation beginning in 2016 that persists until today. So I mean, the whole scheme of having quantitative easing to offset the collapse in oil revenue worked for about a year, but then the price was paid in about January to February, the first quarter of 2016. I mean, the hyperinflation just shot up. I mean, and when that happened, the value of the savings of the middle class was evaporated, which meant the middle class was pauperized. And never mind the value of workers' wages, you know, that went down the drain. It was effectively a radical pay cut. What happened to the workers in early 2016, you know, and it was a massive disaster. And you know, it was really sad because under Chavez, between 2003 and 2013, one of the achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution was precisely that Chavez created a stable middle class. You know, and that middle class, you know, when the value of their savings was evaporated, when the value of their assets was evaporated, that middle class fell right back down into the poor. You know, and today there is no middle class in Venezuela. You know, the middle class either became poor or they fled because, you know, of the crisis. Anyways, the current situation. Okay, Maduro had two choices in 2014, and he chose the wrong choice. You know, one, and this is something that is talked about in the article. Maduro had the choice of, you know, throw out imperialism and expropriate the capitalists, right? What he should have done is he should have expropriated, he should have done what Fidel Castro did in Cuba in 1961, I think, when he just expropriated everything, right? Fidel Castro went a little bit too far. He expropriated the small businesses too. I wouldn't have gone that far, but definitely you could have expropriated Empresas Polar, for example, or some of the big businesses, and take the landowners and all these things, you know, and that would have created the conditions for the socialist government to have a stable, you know, income, or like a stable situation that would have offset the collapse in oil revenues, at least partially. But Maduro chose instead to engage in quantitative easing, and you see where that led. Yeah, you know. So basically, he could have finished what Chavez started and expropriated the capitalists. Instead, he made the workers pay, and effectively he did so because in the first quarter of 2016, the workers took a massive pay cut because of the value of their wages was drastically cut. So the workers paid and the middle class paid. And that's the unfortunate choice, that the choice between, you know, reformism and revolution. Maduro chose reformism, and look what it led him. Keynesianism. Maduro chose Keynesianism, and look what it led him. It led Venezuela. Let's see. The inflation rate, and this is very important, these facts, the inflation rate reached 274% in 2016. Then it increased by to 863% in 2017, 130,060% in 2018, and then it kind of like slowed down a little bit, and it was 9,586% in 2019. I mean, that's worse, far worse than the German hyperinflation in the 20s that put Hitler in power, partly, and or far worse than Zimbabwe in the 90s. Far worse. I mean, Mugabe was better off than Maduro is, you know, or whatever, you know. Let's see. And following the imposition of the imperialist embargo throughout 2018 and 19, and Trump, the embargo that Trump imposed is hardcore. I mean, this is the embargo is hermetic, and nothing goes in and nothing comes out, and Venezuela is cut off from international markets. I mean, all sorts of measures were taken. Venezuela is like cut off from the world economy, basically, unless they do engage in barter with specific countries, like they do with Iran, where they use gold to buy gasoline, because the gasoline, oh, that's another thing. In 2020, the gasoline, before 2020, gasoline in Venezuela was like water. It was cheap, 10 cents a liter. But because of the collapse because the oil production infrastructure collapsed, and the refineries, the infrastructure is dilapidated, the production of gasoline collapsed, and then there ended up with a shortage in Venezuela, a shortage of gasoline. You know, that was crazy. So Maduro made a deal with Iran. Iran sent him gasoline in like tankers, and then Maduro paid with gold, right? And that scheme kind of fell apart because the British confiscated the Venezuelan gold that was in London and gave it over to Guaido, the other president. and that they took about half the gold reserves away from Maduro. So he couldn't kind of continue to do this. But anyways, and then Trump, he ordered the Navy to seize the Iranian oil tankers. So when the oil tankers were coming into Venezuela with gasoline that Maduro had paid for, the Americans would seize them, right? And divert the gasoline to, I think it was Louisiana somewhere. And I don't know what they did with the gasoline. I think they sold it and gave the money to Guaido or something. I don't know what Trump did with that gasoline, but that's what they were doing. They were interdicting the ships. It was a mess. It was a mess. That was Trump's policy. And right. The Maduro regime abandoned policies established by Chavez, such as price and currency controls, imposed since 2003. Beginning in 2020, there has been an informal dollarization of the Venezuelan economy because the Bolivar currency has no value, right? About 54% of transactions in Venezuela during September of 2019 were in US dollars. The number, the number of transactions in dollars raised up to 86% in Maracaibo, which is the second largest city. In 2021, almost all sales of electrical appliances are dollarized, as well as half of the sales of clothes, spare car parts, and food. And food is really sad because to feed a family of 4, you need at least $400 a month, which in Venezuela is a small that's a big amount of money. Here in Sweden, you say $400 is what? 4,000 crowns. It's not much, 4,000 crowns. It's doesn't sound like much, but in Venezuela, that amount of money is a lot of money. And like people, like I was talking to my brother. Apparently, what people eat in Venezuela now is rice and lentils. That's it. That's all you get. That's what people eat. Most people. That's all you can have, because you can't afford anything else. And even if you have the money, there is no guarantee that you can find the actual food to buy. So, most ordinary people have no access to foreign currency. Certainly not the working class. Anyways, the ex-Chavista bureaucracy has entered into a partnership with the capitalists, right? And these capitalists are mostly made up of corrupt financiers and former industrialists, landowners, or whatever. Those three enclaves. Maduro does business with the exiled businessmen in West Venezuela. He has business with them because he uses them to get around the sanctions and the restrictions on the financial services and stuff for in exchange for concessions and whatever. On the other hand, the Maduro regime has unleashed a war, basically a war against working class critics of his neoliberal policies, right? So while he's doing business with the exiled businessmen, he's cracking down on the working class leaders and people from the working class, and this is done with repression, arrests, torture, and it's carried out by the National Guard, the secret police, which is SEVIN, and there's this special forces death squad that he uses to rendition people called FAES. And when you talk to the Venezuelan embassy or whatever, they'll say, oh no, FAES is not that. It's not a death squad. It's not. It's just a special police force to fight drugs. No, and it has been documented. There is video of FAES executing people. I've seen this video. I mean, there is a woman who used to be a FAES captain, and she fled to Germany, and she asked for asylum in Germany, and she gave an interview to the German media about FAES, okay, telling all. So there is proof that the FAES is a death squad, and it has been used to assassinate supporters of APR, the Revolutionary Popular Alternative. 4 sympathizers of APR were killed in one of the rural states. They were assassinated. There have been workers leaders who have been assassinated. And other opposition figures, members of the Communist Party, members of Lucha de Clases, members of the PPT, the rank and file of the PPT, like all the groups that are inside the APR have been subjected to this kind of harassment. And there's evidence of this. This is not made up. This is not, because Maduro claims that this is all lies. This is all lies from the CIA and the opposition and the imperialists and whatever. Is not true. It's documented. It's true. There is proof. And I wanted to talk a little bit about 3 specific cases, just to put names and faces to this situation. Marcos Sabriego and Gil Mujica were arrested by the National Guard, and these workers leaders were complaining about the violation of collective bargaining agreements as they relate to healthcare benefits and health-related working conditions in the state-owned company PDVSA, right? And apparently these 2 were charged with like stealing state secrets and working for the CIA, and it's not true, those are the kind of charges they make up, and it's not true, but that's what they say. And then they arrest them, they rendition them, they arrest them, they send them to some dungeon somewhere, like, and torture them and whatever, and they're not allowed to have contact with their lawyers or with their family members or anything. Another is Eudis Girot, and he has been working in the Venezuelan oil industry for 30 years. And last year, he also took up the issue of the workers' health benefits, which have been drastically cut, and he complained and whatever, and because he said correctly that hyperinflation had pulverized the value of those benefits, and something needed to be done. So he went to complain to the management and whatever. The management made a phone call, called the police, and he was disappeared. That's how it happened here. And in Venezuela, collective bargaining agreements do not have any legal validity. I mean, they're not binding anymore, because Maduro issued a decree in 2018, I think, where the employer or the state can invalidate collective bargaining agreements depending on business conditions if they determine so. So collective bargaining agreements in Venezuela they're not binding, to the employer or the government, not anymore, not under Maduro. And that is why the workers are complaining. One reason why, other than the impact of the massive wage cut that they have taken because of hyperinflation, the neoliberal economic policies that trying to cheapen the value of labor in order to facilitate, the implementation of the Chinese model, the shredding of the healthcare guarantees in the collective bargaining contracts, the shredding of like regulations protecting workers, like in working conditions. Like you're supposed to have like a certain type of a certain type of protection and stuff when you work in the oil industry. They took that away. So like the number of like workers who are injured goes up, and because their healthcare benefits are cut, they don't have any like workplace medicine or whatever. Like that doesn't exist anymore. So those are just some of the issues, right? And then, of course, there is a general situation in Venezuela where, like, for example, the streets are controlled by the criminal gangs. The crime rate in Venezuela is astronomical. I mean, and the murder rate is out of control. And Maduro, the police just look the other way, because the police are bribed by the criminal gangs with hard currency, and they look the other way or whatever. It's a horrible situation. Horrible situation. Anyways, the way forward. And the way forward is what matters, I think, because that's where the hope is. And I will conclude with this because I know I've taken a lot of your time. But, okay. And I'm just going to try to read this because I took it out from the Lucha de Clases article, right? And I want their perspective to be the perspective. Okay, Lucha de Clases, IMT in Venezuela, organizes inside the APR, APR of course, Popular Revolutionary Alternative Coalition, created in August 2020 with the Communist Party and the PPT. And PPT is kind of like the Vanster Party here. They're kind of like an electoral social democrat thing, left social democrat thing, to serve as a left opposition to the Maduro regime. And they have three demands, right? I mean, they have a very elaborate political program, but their demands are very simple. It's three demands. One, index wages to the monthly cost of food for a family of four, which is $400 US. Two, stop the repression against workers who are critical of the neoliberal economic policies of the regime. And this is, you know, the tactic of arrests, detention, torture, assassination that needs to stop. And number three, release all imprisoned workers' leaders. And the calculation is that there are around 150 to 200 workers' leaders who have been disappeared and like taken away or whatever and put away somewhere. You know, their families and lawyers don't know, in many cases don't know where they are. You know, as of October 2021, around 150 to 200. So the campaign of solidarity with the imprisoned Venezuelan workers means those people, right? The lesson, and the following paragraph is my conclusion or whatever. The lesson for the international working class of developments in Venezuela is that the only way to fight back against attempts at the imposition of neoliberal capitalist austerity is to organize mass political opposition against the regimes that seek to implement such policies. It is a matter of collective working class survival. The workers' movement must not compromise with the capitalists, or they will be defeated. On the other hand, the struggle of Venezuelan workers must consider the international context. For global capitalism to be defeated, workers must coordinate their struggles across borders. An isolated revolution would be surrounded and ultimately defeated by imperialism. So, the conclusion in the article, which was put in by, this was by Frederick, put the conclusion in the article that we were. It was Frederick and I who wrote that article together, really. Even though my name is in the article, it was Frederick. Frederick's input is big in this, so I have to give him credit too. He wrote, there needs to be a revolutionary socialist alternative, and that is what the Venezuelan Marxists in Lucha de Clases are fighting for inside APR, which is a popular revolutionary alternative. And that's it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.